The famed Jewish poet Heinrich Heine called Germany a modern Palestine, home of philosophy, mother soil of prophecy, and the citadel of pure spirituality. Why was the Holocaust hatched there, of all places?
Auf der Heide lebt ein kleines Blümelein, und das heißt Erika, heißt von 100.000 kleinen Bienelein, wird und schwärmt Erika, denn ihr Herz ist voller Süßigkeit, wahre Luft entspricht dem Blütenlein. Auf der Heide blüht ein kleines Blümelein, und das heißt Erika.
Was there something special, something different about Germany? Historian, journalist, speech writer, and author Paul Johnson wrote his classic History of the Jews in 1987, declaring that Germany, after World War I, was waiting for Hitler, and Hitler was looking for Germany. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Sounds logical. And it must be true. I read it in a book. But if Nazism was destined to arise in Germany, how do we square that with the fact that in 1924, the Nazis received only 3% of the vote? Does that really sound like Germany was waiting for Hitler? Consider then that 4 years later, in the elections of 1928, the Nazi vote actually decreased to 2.6%. In that year, 30% voted socialist, and 11% voted KDP, communist. So maybe it would be more appropriate to say that Germany was waiting for Stalin. How did Hitler rise to power in such a political environment? He triangulated. Triangulation is about presenting one's ideology as above and between the left and right sides or wings of a traditional democratic political spectrum. It involves adopting some of the ideas of one's political opponents, taking credit for the opponent's ideas, and insulating the triangulator from attacks. The easiest way to explain this is to look at the initials of the Nazi Party, NSDAP. NS stands for National Socialist, D for Deutschland, A for Arbeiter, or workers, P for party. So we have the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The name itself is a strange, triangulated jumble of right and left. National and German make it sound like the political right wing, and socialist and workers obviously evoke the left. Hitler and the Nazis cleverly appealed to both. Some ask, why didn't the political left unite and try to stop Hitler? Answer, Hitler's opponents were too busy fighting with each other. The socialists didn't like the communists didn't like the socialists. End of story. And Hitler, like any good politician, knew how to use just the right slogans to increase his appeal. Of course, he always employed the art of euphemism. In German, Sprachregelung, making sure that he never said anything too openly. A good politician must also allow for some wiggle room. Germany, he said, needed more Lebensraum, living room. That appealed to good German nationalist sentiment. And he spoke of the Reich being Judenrein, free of Jews, literally clean of Jews. Perversely, he used the language of cleanliness, hygiene. Call it political hygiene. But the real issue remains. Why did the Holocaust originate in Germany? As we can imagine, there are multiple theories. One dominant theory was advanced by Daniel Goldhagen in his best-selling book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans in the Holocaust. Namely, that Hitler was a direct result of a long series of developments, specifically linked to Germany and German history. There's something special about Germany, going way back to the old Teutonic tribesmen, and a respect for order and authority, blind devotion to leaders, the militaristic click of the heels. Eliminationist anti-Semitism, argues Goldhagen, was the cornerstone of German national identity. And this type of anti-Semitism was unique to Germany. That's why ordinary German conscripts killed Jews without batting an eye. The second school of thought argues exactly the contrary. Hitler was a break from German tradition. All European countries had anti-Semitic elements and anti-Semitic episodes, but Nazism per se had never been part of German history. German history was hardly unique at all. Consequently, something like the Holocaust could theoretically be possible anywhere. Consider the anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence that had been present historically all across Europe. In Ukraine and Poland, there was a horrific Cossack revolt in 1648, led by one Bohdan Khmelnytsky, and resulting in the wholesale slaughter of over 100,000 Jews. In Prague, there was such a legacy of anti-Semitic unrest that a legend arose regarding a Frankenstein-esque creature fashioned from clay by a great rabbi and commissioned to protect the Jewish inhabitants from a murderous mob. In the late 19th century, there was the notorious Dreyfus affair, in which a Jewish French military officer was falsely accused of treason and sent to Devil's Island for hard labor. In Hungary, there were anti-Semitic upheavals in 1919 and 1920. In Russia, there was a series of violent pogroms, riots aided and abetted by the civil authorities and targeting over 100 Jewish communities. In fact, Germany makes a good candidate for the country in Europe with the least anti-Semitic violence. Bottom line, it's not necessarily about which nation fostered a mentality suitable to bring about genocide. Arguably, we should look for other factors that make a real difference in the behavior of nations. Do nations treat each other in such a way as to promote conditions that actually foster genocide? Is there a golden rule of international affairs that nations sometimes break? Specifically, in the aftermath of war, how do victorious nations treat the vanquished? Through the principle of involvement or punishment? Consider a bit of history. After the Napoleonic Wars, the victorious nations of Europe gathered at the Congress of Vienna to put the continent back together and chart a course for the future. The idea was to involve the defeated country, in this case France. No harsh punishments would be inflicted, no penalties exacted. The result was relative peace across Europe for almost a perfect century, from 1815 through 1914. But after the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles adopted a very different approach. The vanquished country Germany was to be punished. Of the many provisions in the treaty, one of the most important and controversial required Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war, and under the so-called war guilt clause, to disarm, to make substantial territorial concessions, and pay reparations to certain countries that had formed the Entente powers. The total cost of these reparations was assessed at 132 billion marks, then some $31.4 billion in 1921. This was a sum that would have taken Germany until 1988 to pay in full. The result was a peace that lasted not a century, but from 1919 until 1939. The contrast of these two treaties was the subject of a doctoral dissertation of a great American statesman who later released it as a full-length book, A World Restored, Europe After Napoleon. The author's name, Henry A. Kissinger. Hindsight being 20/20, Germany's humiliation was not the way to go. There was even a group of ex-military men called the Freikorps who felt the humiliation of Germany so deeply that they actually got together to reminisce about the trench warfare of World War I. The obvious commentary is that things in Germany had to be pretty humiliating to get people reminiscing about trench warfare. Well, did we learn anything about international affairs after the catastrophe of World War II? What is Germany like today? Answer, still very orderly, still very respectful of authority, but nothing at all like the Nazi era. And this, above all, is proof that nations can indeed be rehabilitated. But do we have the will? And what are the implications for today's world?